Hi, folks. This is Don Meissner with Linda McQuinn with the North Country Fishing Report. And Linda, we wanted to talk about the very thing that happened just yesterday when we were driving.
Yes, we were on a trip, going to a meeting, and
The meeting was in Lake Placid,
Yes,
and it was all about the development of the
economic development and the North Country Regional Economic Development Council. But the topic of this particular show is something that we saw crossing the road as we were driving, and it was a porcupine.
Well, when it happened, you go to me, what is that crossing the road? And I thought at first it was a snapping turtle because it was moving at the same pace and it was carrying its head similar. And I said, no, Linda, that's a porcupine.
Yes, and my response to you was, I thought they were nocturnal. And in fact, after doing some research, we discovered that they primarily are nocturnal, but they can be found in the daylight, just moving very slowly. And it's rather interesting to note that with the porcupine, they are perceived to be an animal that throws their quills, which is their primary defense. But in our research, we discovered that in fact they don't launch them necessarily. The quills are used as a defense mechanism, but they're used in defense when a predator comes too close, and they can either kind of move forward, and the quills are embedded into the animal or the person, or they can move sideways, and that's how the quills are embedded. They clatter their teeth, which is another form of defense that they're trying to ward off a predator.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is years ago, in my life, I used to have a time when I spent day after day walking just out in the woods and sort of reflecting, and it was a substitution for being able to get fishing at that time. But in doing that, I got such an insight into some of the life around. And one of the things in that walk, I would come to a couple porcupines that I came to know. And I knew at the time they weren't aggressive at all. In fact, they would let me walk right up to them, and they didn't show any of this hostility we're talking about. And I remember I used to talk to them, not that you can make wild animals pets, but I just wanted to share that moment. And the thing I remembered so much was how I used to feel. I used to hate porcupines because when I was a kid, we had the dogs that we had I just loved those animals. They were my companions. And I remember Dad and I went on a trip one time hunting, and the dogs got into a porcupine. And so each of our dogs was covered with quills. And we went back to the vet, and I was beside myself watching the vet work on the dogs. And he said, when those quills go inside the animal, the dog or whatever animal gets them, those quills will penetrate and they'll keep going inside. And you can't really pull them out very easily. And they'll work their way all throughout the body. In other words, if they go in their face, they're going to come out the other side of their jaw or their head maybe a few weeks later. And so I thought that our dogs were going to die. They both lived. But this was why I felt about porcupines like I did. And I've thought through the years, after having those times when I go on my walks and I'd see these porcupines and watch how they weren't really concerned with me being there with them. They didn't do any of these aspects that we just learned about, where they gnash their teeth and they start walking sideways, that allows those quills to become kind of a weapon. But they don't throw them. And the thing of it is, those quills are actually hair.
Mm-hmm. Yes. When the porcupets, which are the very young,
they're the pets I had.
when the very young, when they're first born,
that's their name.
Yeah, that's correct. That's their name for the very young when they're first born, and within a couple of days of after birth, that's when the quills start to form. but initially those quills are simply soft fur. But it's the keratin that creates the hardness that forms the quill. But you know something? I think the story that you've just shared about your family pets, they were probably your hunting dogs, and
Yeah.
you and your dad would take them with you when you would go. I think that's very special. That's certainly a lovely story that, these poor dogs, they got into some porcupines, and good grief, they had to have vet care because they
Yeah.
were in such pain.
Well, yeah, people probably thinking, what in the world? This is about fishing, the fishing report. What does a porcupine have to do with fishing? But it's actually what we come across when we're out in the woods, and when we are fishing, we're really entering that other world that a lot of people don't feel we're a part of anymore.
Yes, and in fact, in a prior show, we talked about the evolution of your radio show, and it's difficult to only focus on fishing when there's so much else that's going on around you. So
Well,
it's
that's the beauty of the experience, and I've talked about that before. When I go fishing, the experience that you're having at that time is you're reacting or enacting or whatever with all the different things that are out there around you. And they
right.
become part of your life at that moment.
That's right.
And I think it really adds to your life.
Yes, that's very true. So it was good that we did this particular topic of the porcupine, because I learned so much about your early life with your dad.
Well, the other thing that I did that was part of that I would like to add is those times when I had my porcupine friends out there in the woods and I knew where they were. There was also a time in the spring, like right now, when the vultures returned, the turkey vultures that we have. And when I first would see them, and they'd land in trees around the trail that I walked on, and when they'd see me coming, they passed their alarm, and up they got, and they flew away. And as the days went on, they came to recognize me, I believe, and they knew I wasn't a threat. And so they let me walk right under the trees, and I hope they didn't think I was bait. But anyway, that was another thing that has stuck with me all these years, is how I think those animals came to react to whatever's around them. Like in the case of me, I was just, I certainly wasn't their friend, but they didn't feel I was an enemy.
And the human presence, I think, is very important, simply because if there is no threat perceived, there's a sort of an acceptance, if you will,
Yeah.
that we can move in the natural environment, and we're not a threat to other species that are there.
Well, I remember once doing a radio show about this, about the bobcat that I came upon and how I reacted. And it's always been a part of the shows that I do, the things that I encounter. Until next time, folks, this is Don Meissner with the North Country Porcupine.
Fishing report.
Yes.